January 897, Rome. Inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the most powerful men in Christianity gathered for a trial unlike any in history. But the defendant wasn't some heretic or political enemy. The accused sat slumped on a throne, dressed in full papal regalia, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to defend himself. Because Pope Formosus had been dead for 9 months. The stench hit the assembled bishops first. Even in the cold Roman winter, the smell of decomposition filled the sacred hall. Servants had dressed the corpse in the same ceremonial robes Formosus wore in life: the white papal cassock, the golden pallium, the jeweled mitre. But no amount of incense could mask what lay beneath those holy garments. The skin had turned black and leathery. The lips had pulled back from the teeth in a permanent grimace. The hands, positioned to hold the papal staff, had already begun losing fingers. Pope Stephen VI, very much alive and very much insane, paced before the corpse like a prosecutor who'd finally cornered his prey. His voice echoed through the basilica as he hurled accusations at the rotting body. Perjury, ambition, illegitimacy. Each charge more ridiculous than the last, each one shouted at a man who couldn't hear, couldn't respond, couldn't do anything but slowly decay in front of Rome's religious elite. A terrified deacon stood beside the corpse, forced to serve as Formosus's defense attorney. His job was to speak for the dead pope, to answer Stephen's accusations, to somehow defend a client who was literally falling apart. Every few minutes, another piece of decomposed flesh would drop from the corpse onto the marble floor, and the deacon's voice would crack a little more. This wasn't justice. This wasn't even theater. This was something far more disturbing, a public display of power so absolute, so unhinged, that it could put a corpse on trial and force the church's leadership to pretend it was normal. The bishops sat in their carved wooden seats, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, watching their colleague interrogate a cadaver with the same fervor he might question a living heretic. But the madness of this trial had roots far deeper and more disturbing than any theological dispute. This wasn't about church law or divine justice. This was about revenge, political warfare, and what happens when absolute power meets absolute paranoia. Stephen VI wasn't just trying Formosus. He was trying to erase him from history itself, to unmake every decision the dead pope had made, to prove that even death couldn't protect you from your enemies in medieval Rome. To understand why a dead pope ended up on trial, you need to understand that the papacy in the late 800s wasn't a religious institution. It was a crime syndicate with better robes. This period, which historians would later call the pornocracy, the rule of prostitutes, saw Rome's noble families treating the throne of St. Peter like a family business worth killing for. Formosus had been a survivor in this nightmare. Before becoming pope, he'd served as Bishop of Porto and papal legate to France and Germany. He was brilliant, politically savvy, and dangerously ambitious. He'd been excommunicated once already for allegedly conspiring against Pope John VIII, forced into exile, and then miraculously pardoned when political winds shifted. When he finally became pope in 891, he was already in his 70s and had more enemies than friends. His biggest mistake was picking the wrong side in Italy's imperial power struggle. The peninsula was torn between rival factions claiming the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Formosus backed Arnulf of Carinthia, crowning him emperor and giving him papal blessing to invade Italy. This enraged the Spoleto family, particularly Duke Lambert and his mother Agiltrude, who'd invested heavily in controlling the papacy for their own political ends. Agiltrude was the real power behind the Spoleto throne, a woman who'd allegedly poisoned rivals, arranged assassinations, and manipulated papal elections with a skill that would have impressed the Borgias centuries later. When Formosus crowned her family's enemy as emperor, he signed his own death warrant. The fact that he died of natural causes in 896 probably disappointed her. She'd been planning something far more dramatic. But death didn't end Agiltrude's revenge. She'd placed her own puppet on the papal throne, Stephen VI, a weak-willed bishop who'd been ordained by Formosus himself. Stephen owed everything to the man now rotting in his tomb, but he owed his current power to the Spoletos, And the Spoletos wanted more than Formosus dead. They wanted him destroyed, humiliated, erased from history. They wanted every decision he'd made unmade, every alliance he'd forged broken, every ordination he'd performed invalidated. Stephen VI received his instructions clearly. Dig up Formosus, put him on trial, find him guilty, destroy his legacy so completely that it would serve as a warning to any future pope who dared defy the Spoleto family. The message was clear. We can get you even after you're dead. Not even the grave is safe from our reach. Other bishops had no choice but to participate. Refusing to attend the trial meant challenging the Spoletos, which meant assassination, exile, or worse. So they came, they sat, they watched a corpse being interrogated, and they pretended this was somehow normal church procedure. Some genuinely believed Stephen's accusations. Most were just terrified of becoming the next target. What none of them realized was that the trial itself would unleash forces that even the powerful Spoleto family couldn't control. Because Romans, superstitious and deeply religious, were about to witness something that would make them question everything they believed about divine justice, papal authority, and the thin line between political theater and sacrilege. The Cadaver Synod was about to become the most infamous trial in Christian history, and everyone in that room would soon pay the price for participating in it. The trial proceeded with the grotesque formality of a legal proceeding designed by madmen. Stephen VI had prepared a complete list of charges, witnesses, and evidence, all directed at a corpse that was actively decomposing in front of everyone. The absurdity would have been comical if it wasn't so deeply disturbing. Stephen's voice cracked as he screamed his accusations. You left the bishopric of Porto to seize the papal throne. You violated canon law. You ordained bishops illegally. Each charge punctuated by his fist slamming on the armrest of his throne, each accusation growing more hysterical. The dead pope sat silent, head tilted at an unnatural angle, jaw hanging slack. Fluids that had once been internal were seeping through the ceremonial vestments, leaving dark stains on the white papal cassock. The defense attorney, a young deacon named Theodore who'd drawn the shortest straw in church history, stood beside the corpse trying to formulate responses. His job was impossible. How do you defend a client who can't instruct you, can't confirm facts, can't even stay upright without being propped up? Theodore's voice shook as he recited formulaic responses. The Holy Father acted within his authority. The Holy Father followed precedent. The Holy Father... And then he'd have to pause, as another finger fell from Formosus's hand, clattering onto the marble floor. The bishops in attendance were trapped in their own private hells. Some kept their eyes fixed on the floor, unable to watch. Others stared straight ahead with the blank expression of men witnessing something that would haunt them forever. A few whispered prayers, though whether they were praying for Formosus's soul or their own salvation was unclear. The smell was overwhelming. Even the most expensive perfumes and incense couldn't cover the stench of 9-month-old death. Then came the moment that would be recorded in every chronicle of the trial. Stephen VI, working himself into a frenzy of righteous rage, stood and walked directly to the corpse. He leaned in close, his face inches from Formosus's rotting visage, and screamed, "Answer me! Why did you betray the church?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Stephen waited, as if genuinely expecting the corpse to respond. The silence stretched unbearably. Then Stephen spat, directly into the dead pope's face. The saliva ran down the blackened skin, mixing with the fluids already leaking from the decomposing tissue. Several bishops gasped. Others looked away. Theodore the deacon stood frozen, understanding that this had crossed from legal proceeding into something far darker. Ritual humiliation of the dead, desecration masquerading as justice. But Stephen wasn't finished. He grabbed the corpse by its ceremonial robes and shook it, shouting accusations directly into its unhearing ears. The body jerked and swayed like a grotesque marionette. More pieces fell away, bits of skin, fragments of bone, the papal ring slipping from a skeletal finger. The sight of the living pope manhandling the dead one, broke whatever thin veneer of normalcy had remained. This wasn't a trial anymore. It was an exorcism, a purging, a man trying to kill someone who was already dead. The bishops forced to witness this understood they were seeing something unprecedented and unholy. The church had rules about respecting the dead, about proper burial, about the sanctity of former popes. Stephen VI was violating every single one, and doing it with the full authority of his office. If a pope could do this to his predecessor, what could he do to them? What had the papacy become when its highest office could be used to torture the dead? Stephen finally stepped back, breathing hard, sweat running down his face despite the winter cold. He turned to face the assembled bishops and delivered his verdict with the confidence of a man who knew no one would dare disagree. Guilty. Guilty of every charge. This man was never legitimately pope. Every ordination he performed is invalid. Every bishop he consecrated is no bishop at all. Every decision he made is void. The implications were staggering. Hundreds of priests and bishops suddenly stripped of their authority, their entire careers built on an ordination now declared illegal. But the verdict was just the beginning. The punishment would be even worse than anyone imagined. The sentence came swiftly. Strip the corpse of all papal vestments. Sever the 3 fingers of his right hand, the fingers used to give papal blessings. Drag the body through the streets of Rome as a common criminal. Then throw what remained into the Tiber River like garbage. The mutilation happened in the basilica itself, turning sacred ground into an execution chamber. Stephen ordered a priest to bring a blade. The man hesitated, understanding that cutting a former pope's fingers, even a dead one's, was an act of desecration that could never be undone. But refusing meant defying the current pope, which meant joining Formosus in disgrace. The priest knelt beside the corpse, positioned the blade, and with 3 swift cuts removed the blessing fingers from Formosus's right hand. The fingers fell to the marble floor with small hollow sounds. No blood came. There was nothing left inside the body to bleed. The stumps were just dried tissue and exposed bone. Stephen picked up one of the severed fingers, held it up for all to see, and declared, "These fingers blessed no one. These fingers had no authority. These fingers damned those who received their blessings." Then he threw it across the basilica like trash. Next came the stripping. Servants were ordered to remove the papal vestments from the corpse. They approached reluctantly, trying not to breathe through their noses, trying not to look at what they were touching. The golden vestments peeled away, taking bits of decomposed flesh with them. Underneath, the body was revealed in all its horror. Blackened skin stretched tight over bones, the chest cavity partially collapsed, limbs bent at unnatural angles from months of rigor mortis and decay. They dressed the corpse in rags, the kind of clothes worn by executed criminals. Then they tied ropes around it and began dragging. The body bumped down the basilica steps, head lolling, limbs flopping. Pieces broke off during the journey. An ear, clumps of hair, more fingers. A trail of decomposition marked the path through Rome's streets. The citizens of Rome came out to watch. Some cheered, particularly those loyal to the Spoleto family. They threw garbage at the corpse, shouted insults at the dead pope, celebrated his humiliation. But others watched in horrified silence. These were people who'd been blessed by Formosus, who'd seen him perform mass, who'd believed in his authority as pope. Watching his corpse dragged through mud and filth like a criminal shook something fundamental in their faith. The procession reached the Tiber River at sunset. The executioners, because that's what they'd become, carried the corpse to the bridge. Stephen VI had followed the entire way, ensuring his orders were carried out completely. He stood at the railing and watched as they prepared to throw Formosus into the water. One final indignity remained. Before disposal, they stripped the corpse completely naked. Every last shred of clothing removed, every remaining symbol of office taken away. What had been Pope Formosus, supreme pontiff of the Catholic Church, was now just rotting meat about to be thrown in a river like a dead animal. They heaved the body over the railing. It hit the water with a splash that seemed too small for what had once been a human being. For a moment, The corpse floated, face down, carried by the current. Then it began to sink, pulled under by the weight of decomposition-filled lungs and the river's dark depths. Stephen watched until it disappeared completely beneath the surface, a satisfied smile on his face. He'd done it. He'd destroyed Formosus completely, humiliated him, mutilated him, erased him from the church's records, and disposed of him like trash. The Spoleto family would be pleased. His position was secure. He'd proven that even death provided no escape from papal justice. But Rome wasn't finished with this story. The Tiber River had witnessed countless bodies over the centuries, but it had never held a pope before. And superstitious Romans were about to decide that throwing a former pontiff into their sacred river might have consequences that not even Stephen VI had anticipated. Dark forces were gathering, both natural and political, that would turn Stephen's triumph into his own nightmare. 3 days after Formosus's body sank into the Tiber, Rome's Basilica of St. John Lateran collapsed. Not the whole building, just the section where the trial had taken place. The walls cracked during the night, support columns buckled, and by morning the entire apse had crumbled into rubble. No one was killed because it happened when the basilica was empty, which made the Romans even more convinced this was divine intervention. God had waited until the building was empty to express his rage at what had happened inside it. Then came the earthquakes, small tremors at first, barely noticeable. Then stronger ones that knocked items off shelves, cracked walls, sent Romans running into the streets in panic. Medieval people didn't understand plate tectonics or fault lines. They understood divine punishment. And watching their city shake while their river held a mutilated pope's corpse, they connected the dots in the only way that made sense to them. A Benedictine monk named Eustace, who'd served under Formosus, took matters into his own hands. He went to the Tiber with nets and hooks, determined to recover the body before it was lost forever. For days he searched the river, pulling up garbage, dead animals, everything except what he was looking for. Other monks joined him. They worked in shifts, dragging the riverbed, searching the banks downstream, refusing to give up. On the 5th day, they found him. The corpse had washed up on a sandbar several miles from where it had been thrown in. The river had not been kind. More decomposition, more damage, barely recognizable as human. But the monks knew what they'd found. They wrapped it in clean cloth, smuggled it to a monastery outside Rome, and gave Formosus the burial he'd been denied. Word spread quickly through the city's religious communities. And then the miracles started. Or at least, that's what people called them. A blind beggar touched Formosus's tomb and claimed his sight returned. A woman with a crippled hand said she could move her fingers after praying at his grave. A child sick with fever recovered after his mother brought him to the monastery. Were these genuine miracles or desperate people experiencing placebo effects? In medieval Rome, it didn't matter. The story was taking on a life of its own. The cult of Formosus the martyr grew daily. Pilgrims began visiting the tomb. Monks started collecting his story, writing it down, emphasizing his persecution by the corrupt Stephen VI. The narrative shifted. Formosus wasn't a guilty pope who'd violated canon law. He was a victim of political machination, a holy man murdered by ambition even after death. The trial wasn't justice, it was sacrilege. Stephen VI watched this unfold with growing panic. He'd intended to erase Formosus from history, but he'd accidentally created a martyr. The more he insisted on Formosus's guilt, the more Romans believed in his innocence. The earthquakes continued, small but persistent reminders that something was wrong. The basilica's collapse became proof that God disapproved. Even Stephen's supporters began whispering doubts. But the real crisis was structural, threatening the church itself. If Formosus's ordinations were invalid, then every priest he'd ordained was not actually a priest. Every bishop he'd consecrated was not actually a bishop. Every baptism those priests had performed might not count. Every marriage those bishops had blessed might be invalid. Every mass celebrated by Formosus's priests might not have actually consecrated the Eucharist. The implications cascaded through the church hierarchy like falling dominoes. Bishops who'd been ordained by men who'd been ordained by Formosus found their own authority questioned. Priests refused to accept their assignments because their ordaining bishops might not be legitimate. Parishes split over whether their sacraments were valid. The whole structure of Catholic authority in Italy was suddenly built on sand. Stephen tried to control the damage through more decrees, more pronouncements, more threats. He declared that anyone who questioned the Cadaver Synod's verdict would face excommunication. He ordered monasteries to stop spreading stories about Formosus's miracles. He sent armed men to prevent pilgrims from reaching the tomb. Every action made things worse. Rome's noble families, always opportunistic, sensed weakness. The Spoletos had used Stephen to destroy Formosus, but Stephen was becoming a liability. He'd created chaos instead of order, division instead of unity. Other families began positioning their own candidates for the papacy, already planning for when Stephen's usefulness ended. The man who'd put a corpse on trial was about to discover that in Rome's political landscape, living popes were even more disposable than dead ones. The tipping point came when a delegation of bishops approached Stephen with a petition. They'd done the theological math, and it didn't work. If Formosus's papacy was completely invalid, then his ordination of Stephen VI was also invalid, which meant Stephen himself was not legitimately pope. By destroying his predecessor's authority, Stephen had destroyed his own. The logic was inescapable and horrifying. Stephen's response was pure panic. He ordered the bishops arrested, but his guards hesitated. He called for supporters, but fewer came each day. He tried to flee Rome but found the gates blocked by crowds who'd decided he was responsible for God's wrath, shaking their city. The trap he'd built for a dead man was closing around him, and there was nowhere left to run. Summer 897, just 8 months after the Cadaver Synod, and Rome had reached its breaking point. The earthquakes continued. Food shortages hit the city as farmers refused to bring goods to a place cursed by God. Disease spread through overcrowded neighborhoods. And Stephen VI, trapped in the Lateran palace, could hear the angry crowds growing larger outside his walls every day. The revolt came at night. A mob of Romans, led by supporters of Formosus and members of rival noble families, stormed the palace. Stephen's guards, underpaid and unconvinced their pope was worth dying for, opened the gates without a fight. The mob flooded through corridors where popes had ruled for centuries, their torches casting dancing shadows on ancient walls. They found Stephen in his private chambers, trying to hide behind his bed like a terrified child. The men who dragged him out showed no mercy. This was the man who'd desecrated a pope's corpse, who'd thrown a former pontiff in the river, who'd brought divine wrath down on their city. They had years of anger to work through, and one night to do it. First came the humiliation. They stripped Stephen of his papal vestments, the same way he'd stripped Formosus. They tore off the white cassock, ripped away the pallium, threw the papal mitre across the room. They dressed him in prisoner's rags and dragged him through the same palace halls where he'd walked in triumph just months before. The mob pulled him into the streets, and Rome came out to watch. This time there was no divided crowd, no political supporters. Everyone had suffered under Stephen's reign. The chaos, the fear, the religious uncertainty. They lined the streets and watched as their pope was dragged past like a criminal, just as he'd dragged Formosus. Some threw garbage, others spat. Many just stared in silence, watching the mighty brought low. They threw him in prison, in a cell beneath the old fortress near the Forum. It was small, dark, airless, and already occupied by several other prisoners. Stephen, who'd slept in papal luxury, now lay on stone soaked with the filth of previous occupants. The other prisoners recognized him and kept their distance, afraid to be associated with a fallen pope, but also afraid of what he represented, proof that no one was safe, that power could vanish overnight. For weeks, Stephen languished there. He could hear Rome above him, the sound of daily life, of markets and churches and people moving on. Occasionally, guards would bring barely edible food and filthy water. He'd beg them for news, for information about what would happen to him, but they never answered. The silence was worse than any torture. He didn't know if he'd be executed, exiled, or left to rot. The end came quietly. One morning, guards found him dead in his cell. The official report said natural causes, that he'd died of fever or perhaps grief. But the way his body was positioned told a different story. His hands were at his throat, fingers clawed, eyes bulged. The bruising around his neck suggested strangulation. Someone had visited him in the night, a prisoner seeking revenge, a hired assassin, or perhaps guards tired of feeding him. No one investigated. No one cared. They carried Stephen's body out of the prison on a plank, just as undignified as for Moses's final journey. But there was no trial for Stephen's corpse, no formal condemnation. The Romans had learned their lesson about judging dead popes. Instead, they gave him a quick, unceremonious burial in an unmarked grave outside the city walls, the kind of burial reserved for criminals and non-Christians. His successor, Pope Romanus, lasted 4 months before he too was deposed. The Pope after that, Theodore II, immediately convened a synod that declared the Cadaver Synod invalid. Formosus was rehabilitated, his ordinations restored, his body exhumed again, this time for honorable reburial in St. Peter's Basilica with full papal honors. Everything Stephen had done was undone, every decree reversed, every condemnation erased. It was as if the Cadaver Synod had never happened. Except everyone knew it had happened. The memory couldn't be erased. 2 popes dead violently within a year, both victims of the same corrupt system. Rome's noble families continued their power games, placing and deposing popes like chess pieces. The earthquakes eventually stopped, but the damage to papal authority lasted for decades. How could people trust an institution that put corpses on trial? How could they believe in religious authority that could be bought, sold, and murdered so casually? The Cadaver Synod became a cautionary tale, whispered in monasteries and discussed in theological debates for centuries. It represented everything wrong with the medieval papacy: the political corruption, the violence, the complete abandonment of spiritual purpose in favor of temporal power. Church historians would try to minimize it, to treat it as an aberration, but the facts remained stubbornly grotesque. 2 popes, one tried after death, mutilated and thrown in a river. The other strangled in a prison cell, buried like a criminal. Both destroyed by the same system they'd tried to use for their own ends. The man who judged a corpse became a corpse himself, and his fate was arguably worse, because at least Formosus was eventually honored as a martyr. Stephen VI was just forgotten, erased from memory, as thoroughly as he'd tried to erase his predecessor. The ultimate irony is that by trying to destroy Formosus completely, Stephen guaranteed he'd be remembered forever. The Cadaver Synod became one of the most infamous events in church history, a story so bizarre and horrifying that it's been told and retold for over 1,000 years. Formosus, the dead pope who was put on trial, achieved a kind of immortality through his persecution. Stephen VI, the living pope who conducted the trial, is remembered only for that one act of grotesque madness. The lesson was clear, though few learned it. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, but trying to destroy your enemies completely often destroys you instead. The medieval papacy would continue its cycles of violence and corruption for centuries more, but never again would they try a corpse in court. That particular brand of insanity died with Stephen VI, strangled in a Roman prison, unmourned and unremembered except as the answer to history's most disturbing question. What happens when you put a dead pope on trial? Everyone involved pays the price, the living even more than the dead.